Hello, everyone, and welcome to Module 3. We will cover language policy and the laws in connection to bilingual education and English learners. I will be using today some of the slides from Dr. Wainwright in connection to the ESSA. We'll talk about it, and I will be using the course, the module designed by Dr. Proctor and Dr. Hamza. Our learning objective is for participants to demonstrate understanding of the policies for language suppression and or revitalization and the laws that influence English learners' instruction. So some key terms that are important as we move on with the course is that the term limited English proficient is a deficient term or a term that refers to English learners from a deficit perspective, that they're limited. And this is an old term used prior to the new law. The new law suggests the term English language learners, which is preferred by most states. Some of us prefer the term bilingual learners because of the additive perspective of bilingualism. There's also the term minoritized that you've heard me use and majoritized. So typically the term is minority or majority, though some of us prefer the term minoritized because we are alluding to the fact that they're not necessarily the minority population because they're not in quantity minority, but they've been minoritized in regards to having less power. So in regards to language policies broadly, we talk about Hawaiian attempts at language revitalization. There was Hawaiian and old colony of the states trying to revitalize, just like many of the native language schools, their language. Internationally, there was an effort among the different nations of the Spanish country, or the country of Spain, to revitalize their language. Actually, I lived in Barcelona for 2 years, and people wouldn't reply to me if I used Spanish until I told them I was not from Spain. So then they would have mercy on me because I was a colonized population as well. And with fascism, with Franco taking over in the 50s, of course, Spanish was imposed and it was forbidden for the regions to use their own language, just as it happened with the Native Americans here. The Haitian Creole as well has been revitalizing their own Creole French versus the school French. And we see that schools have emerged as places for revitalization or as places for suppression. So who do we want to be is the question. So language and education policy in the United States. The first aspect that I want to bring to your attention is how the Cuban Revolution of 1959 brought Spanish-speaking populations to Florida, as we said before, along with Puerto Rican migration to New York City and other northern US cities, as well as Mexican immigration to the Southwest. And the situation in Mexico in the Southwest is a little bit different because that area was already part of the Spanish-speaking world. And with the influx of the English speakers after the American-Mexican War, where Mexico lost the territory, the lands and the language were expropriated a little bit the way it had happened with the natives first, though many stayed unacculturated or assimilated. Then we have a decade after that, within the decade, the civil rights era. And there was a lot of policy emerging during this time. And one of the most important acts for bilingual education was the Bilingual Education Act from 1965, which was part of Title VII. And there are different titles as education law. And Title VII included the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And that act had as well, or what in the same title, it was included as well, the Bilingual Education Act. And the term limited English proficient was introduced at this point. And we'll talk about what that involved when we talk about the Supreme case and some of the most important Supreme Court cases. There were also community movements. So there were the Young Lords in New York City, Puerto Ricans that stood up to revitalize their culture and language, the Southwest Chicano movement as well, mainly in Chicago, but in many other places, and the Coral Way School in Dade County, Florida, with the Cubans asking to continue their education in Spanish so that the students wouldn't remain behind. And that was the main argument given, and the main argument in the Lau versus Nichols case of the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court saw how, or stood by the families when the families pleaded for education that was accessible, and the only way it was accessible was in their home language, as it used to be in the 700s with the Germans and with other populations, considering that they couldn't speak the language yet, with the condition that they would also learn English for communal communication and unity in the country. So as I mentioned, the Lau versus Nichols case, the 1974 case, was a landmark Supreme Court decision. It was in San Francisco with a group of Chinese families who won the case. Actually, they appealed the case after losing the case to the Supreme Court, and they won the case at a Supreme Court level. So this became a national practice at that point to allow for bilingual education in order to really fully address the curriculum needs of the students. So during the Bilingual Education Act years, most states signed significant limited English proficient populations. Most states with significant limited English populations began to provide a variety of bilingual programs. So we saw that happening in California, in Texas, Arizona, New York, Illinois, etc. In 1971, Massachusetts was the first state to make bilingual education a requirement. And it was through Chapter 71A. If a district has 20 or more speakers of a single language within K through 12, the district must offer bilingual education. For example, native language education instruction, in addition to English. So this is very significant because that led the way for other states to adopt similar rules, policies. However, some districts in some states, they would ask for 20 or more students to speak the same language in the same grade. So that became less of a predictor for bilingual education, but a little bit more feasible for the schools. And there's other states where not even when you have 20 speakers of the same language in the same grade, they still get away with not offering bilingual education because of the way the law is written in each state. So by 1997, 11 states had legislated bilingual education. So since 1965, reauthorizations of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the ESEA, weakened bilingual education. So this was an act that, as part of Title VII, that offered some specific laws for education in general. And even though there was a bilingual act, that lost strength, and the ESEA prevailed. And that's what George W. Bush in 2001 reinstated the ESEA, calling it No Child Left Behind, and it lasted 13 years. And in this reauthorization, Title VII was eliminated and replaced with the English Language Acquisition or Language Enhancement and Academic Achievement Act. So the word bilingual is expunged from federal education policy totally at this point. So Obama administration renames the No Child Left Behind to Every Student Succeeds Act, because there were many notable flaws in the No Child Left Behind, and we'll talk about that. However, he did not reinstate the bilingual education, and there were no substantial differences between these education laws in terms of bilingual education. Meanwhile, at the polling place in California, Ron Unz, the Silicon Valley millionaire, writes the English for the Children ballot initiative. So this ballot proposes to prohibit native language instruction in California and requires sheltered English immersion for all students who are English limited or English learners, and assumes a 1-year immersion period for English learners before mainstreaming. So you have 1 year, the school can fix you in 1 year before you can be in English monolingual and succeed. It's a success story when you can forget about your language and just go into English immersion. So I'm being a little bit cynical, but this was very tragic because, however, this person had a lot of money. The propaganda was incredible, and there was no research founding this proposal. There was no use of research of how many years it takes for students to be able to acquire enough English. We know it's not 1 year. And we know that the role now, even with neurological studies, the role of the first language in the acquisition of English. So even if you have a subtractive perspective, the abandonment of the native language, it's a complete error according to research. So then what happened was what we are calling the eastward expansion, not the westward, but the eastward expansion of English for the children. So this happened in California soon after Arizona and Massachusetts adopted it. So the initiative was adopted. Bilingual education was prohibited in 1998 for California, in 2000 for Arizona, in 2002 for Massachusetts. Texas followed. And the initiative, however, that had been adopted before prohibiting bilingual education or proposed in Colorado to prohibit bilingual education was declined. So it did not succeed in Colorado. And actually, according to the migration policy website, Colorado has much better statistics for bilingual learners than any of these other states in regards to state assessments. So this is what the story of Massachusetts. That's what's interesting is that it's a similar story trajectory as California, Arizona, and Texas. So I'm using it. In 1971, being the first state to state as a law to have bilingual education, it went to becoming an English for the children, English only state for 15 years, audited by the Department of Justice in 2011. And the state faulted for not adequately preparing teachers for working with English learners. So that was the conclusion when it was audited. Instead of that, the law was wrong, the policy was not research-based. The conclusion was that the problem was that the teachers were not adequately prepared. So finally, in 2018, there was a new bill. It was called the LOOK, Language Opportunity for Our Kids bill, reinstates bilingual education as legal. There's an outburst of dual language programs in the state, and there's incredible support among the communities to open two-way immersion programs. Principles of English for children remain. That is, the condition is that students also have to learn English, which is understandable. More than understandable, is necessary for equity purposes and equal opportunity. So that in regards to language policy. When we talk about law in education, it's a lot, and you can read it, but you'll find it in your supplementary readings. But in general, this is the timeline. There was in the 1960s the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the Bilingual Act, replaced in 2002. No mention of bilingual education at this point, replaced by No Child Left Behind, and continuing with limited English proficient as a term, the subtractive perspective, switching into the at least non-subtractive perspective of English learners, with the Every Student Succeed Act in 2015, but still no mention of bilingual education as a federal law. However, even though there's no federal law, there's strong Supreme Court cases. And since we follow a common law, many states look at the Supreme Court cases as models to implement in their states. So that's been what we hold on to for states, to demand from states to allow for bilingual and dual language education. So just in general, I'm going to go through these next slides very quickly. The Every Student Succeeds Act from 2015 from Obama is the latest reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act from 1965. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, then therefore, as you saw in the timeline, became the No Child Left Behind. And there were many flaws with No Child Left Behind. I'm just going to tell you just briefly, instead of going through every single detail of the slides. The problem really was that it based most of the main measure was state assessments or high stake assessments with no inclusion of bilingual cohorts for the first 3 years. So schools would simply concentrate on the classes that were going to take the test. So many subgroups suffer the consequences. There was very little opportunity for creativity and innovation as well for the states and for the schools. It was very much top directed from federal perspective. The followed renovation or the renewed Elementary and Secondary Education Act, after being No Child Left Behind, became Every Student Succeeds Act with Obama. And it's not perfect either, because it can be very ambiguous, but it gave the states leeway to stipulate different parameters for success. So it has that aspect of flexibility. And the standards remain essentially the same. State must adopt challenging state academic standards, must be aligned with entrance requirements for credit-bearing coursework in the system of public higher education. So they have to be career ready. Then testing remained, the regime of the testing remains the same. So there's annual testing of English learners, in English language arts and in mathematics, grades 3 through 8. And once in high school. There's a testing of science once in elementary, middle school, and high school. So there are subgroups in every school, as we know. We have our ethnic groups, minoritized groups. We have our English learners and our students with an IEP, personalized plan of studies. So one of the main changes was that in No Child Left Behind, students were not accounted for, as I mentioned, and the schools that did not meet the passing rates were punished by being dissolved, etc. Principals would lose their job, and so on. So many times teachers did not, and also their accountability was linked to the students' scores. So many times teachers did not want to have these students in their classrooms because they were afraid of losing their jobs. And teachers who had the high achieving students were rewarded for it. So that was one of the flaws. So with the new, the advantages of the Every Student Succeeds Act, we see that there was different accountability. So there was no more connecting the results of the state assessments with teaching performance evaluations. And schools could still be admonished, and there were consequences for them and for the principals, but there was a plan of progress, and there was a growth plan that served as a measure rather than meeting a benchmark for all. For the English learners, before, as I said, there was less flexibility and therefore no accountability. And with the Every Student Succeeds Act, it included options. So students could take the test or should take the test in the first year just to, if possible, to capture the data, but it didn't count towards school achievement. And students could take in any language, in their home language, and the other assessments, not English. And also in the second year, they could take it, but there was, instead of needing to meet a specific benchmark, as I said, they could just show a progress that the school would determine based on state regulations. So there was much more flexibility. So there was still accountability for growth, but without that black and white perspective that No Child Left Behind had. So there were positive implications for ELS, as I mentioned, the change from limited English proficiency to English learners, removable of unrealistic expectations like 100% of the ELS passing the state assessments by a given year, by year 4 it was. Requirement for an English language subgroup means needs of ELS can't be ignored. So there was some accountability, so that was good because they were being ignored before. The move of English language proficiency standards and assessments from Title III to Title I. So it became more prestigious in a way, these services for ELS, more flexibility in the goal setting, in the interventions as well, some relief from the ELS test scores and school accountability, teacher evaluations not tied to individual ELS scores, and some considerations of ELS students' English language proficiency levels and accountability of growth over time, as I mentioned. So the concerns of the current law is that the focus is still on accountability through high stakes tests, and this should not be the only measure that tells how efficient instruction is, and also validity and reliability issues and ineffectiveness of accommodations for ELS on large-scale tests have not been resolved. So it's hard to know exactly what students need to use. For that, we use a formative assessments more than the high-stake tests. And 3 years, likely not enough time for ELS to develop sufficient English proficiency before their test scores are used for school accountability. And also the inclusion of former English learners in this subgroup is an advantage for the school, but it can skew the results of how really the English learners are doing. Still no focus on biliteracy at all, and many unknowns about the implementation. So many times it depends on how the states and the districts implement what the federal purpose of the